Hey guys, it's Sam Geek, and today I'm going to be talking about anarcho-capitalism. My issue with a lot of anarcho-capitalists is that they don't understand that it's a philosophy. It's a good philosophy, don't get me wrong, but I don't think it can be ever implemented in society. Let's say we tear down America, tear down the government, and it's replaced with an anarcho-capitalist society. How would we implement that? We're now in a voluntary society with no real law, no restriction on capitalism. What's to say that a lot of corporations would move out of America at that point because the market's huge, but there's really no way to take advantage of it because there's no stable currency and there's no real ways to invest and stuff, and there's no incentive provided by certain areas, and there's no real way to actually secure from anyone just ripping them off and making the exact same product. There's no copyright, there's no trademark, there's nothing. It'd be very difficult living in the newly transferred anarcho-capitalist society. There would be really no way to determine property. There would be no way to determine currency. There would be no way to actually implement a currency without it being counterfeited or, forged. And there would be no way to actually manage said currency because there would be no way to force, people from not counterfeiting it. Also, what would determine the currency? There would be thousands of competing currencies, and people would try to provide them, and then some currencies would go bankrupt, and therefore you have useless pieces of paper, and there would be no value really determined for them. Arguably, a lot of people can say that's what we have now, but having one centralized currency, defined by borders, enforced by police, and enforced by a central entity, actually allows allows the currency to work. Now, a lot of people say, well, we can go back to a currency-less society, but what incentives does that provide for the inventor or creator, and how would they get this necessary goods and services to make things like electronics or the internet or something, innovative like that to actually improve our lives? We would just have mass-produced goods and services, and that's what it would lead to. It would lead to mass-produced goods and services and cheaper goods and services, but it wouldn't lead to innovation. The issue is innovation, and because what incentive is there for me to create something new when I'm not guaranteed that no one can steal it, when I'm not guaranteed that no one can copy it or mass produce the exact same product. I'm also not guaranteed that my product is not able to be stolen directly from me. There's no guarantee to actually inventing something, so there's no incentive. And don't get me wrong, I don't agree with all copyright laws, and I think that trademarks and stuff should be a lot less restrictive and a lot lower. In terms of years, and I don't think you should be able to copyright a lot of software that's distributed, but I do believe that some form of copyright needs to exist, especially for hardware to be innovative. And because you need to focus on you know how you would necessarily create something out of chips and different materials. And also, how would we really determine property when the America is stripped down and the government is destroyed? Who decides what land people own or whose houses people own? There would be no banks or anything really left because a lot of banks do thrive off the government, and there would be no way to determine who owns a bank or who owns what property, and it would often lead to chaos. And you could look at something like the roads. How would the roads be maintained? What would prevent me from putting up, I live on a piece of land next to a road. Let's say I put up a toll booth and say, oh, well, you want to cross this piece of highway? You got to pay me. I own this property. What defines property ownership? What's to prevent me from burning down said toll booth and killing the man in the toll booth? There's no force or will to stop me from doing such a thing, and arguably he could fight back, but there's no real way of him actually, if I got 3 or 4 people to help me and we all got this, There's no real way for him to stop us. The issue is that in a modern day society, we have progressed to the point where we need some type of control. And I don't think we need as much control as we have. I think it needs to be vastly reduced because a lot of control was made for savages. But I do believe that humanity is still animals. We're animals, and we will do anything to get what we want. And there needs to be incentive to create new things, but there also needs to be incentive to, you know, there needs to be incentive to behave properly. And the only way we can really do that is through force. I mean, trading and bartering can only get us so far. And it can't really, stop certain people from doing certain bad things. And although I don't agree with how police forces are ran currently, I do think that some force or some entity or you know, something needs to exist from people beating the shit out of each other, killing each other, violently stealing things, because that's what would happen. Whether you want to agree with it or not, that's what would happen. Because there's nothing to prevent you. There's nothing to prevent someone from killing people if there's no force or will. And you could argue that in a community, people would volunteer said thing, but there's just no reason to do things. And what would happen ultimately if we were an anarcho-capitalist society is that we'd have a ton of overproduced stuff that would end up eventually being meaningless and useless. We'd have tons of overproduced goods and services, and we would really have no strive for innovation because a lot of the things that we use on a daily basis cost billions of dollars and billions of man hours and thousands of just years and years and years of research. I mean, the computer I'm using now, it probably took billions of man hours and billions of dollars to produce this MacBook Air. I mean, just if you take every piece of plastic, the design around it, the crystals in the display, the camera, if you just take all those down and try to figure out how many hours was designed developing this stuff, well, and if you take each company that develops each part of the product and you develop how much that time that took, and what's to say that now we became anarcho-capitalists, America is now anarcho-capitalist, a lot of these businesses just don't move. There's no incentive to stay here. And what we end up is kind of devolving our entire society and becoming like this weird commune of just people with older technology and older ways of thinking, because that's honestly what anarcho-capitalism is. I just don't see how it could ever be implemented into this society, in a modern day society, and how it wouldn't just drive people to move. Now, arguably, a lot of people say, well, that's the whole point of anarcho-capitalism. If you don't like it, you can do whatever you want, and you can go back to a statist society. But, a non-state society almost makes it impossible for there to be innovation. And if we applied this worldwide, what kind of dire consequences would that have? And especially on something like a small island or a small, an area where there's really no incentive. Eventually, those people would have to move even if they like the area. And at that point, it's not very voluntary. And, capitalism has really no purpose without currency. I'm sorry, but I just don't see the point in capitalism without currency, and I don't see the point in capitalism without property. Anyways, I know I've probably pissed off a lot of people, and there'll probably be thousands of retorts and thousands of examples like, oh, Samuel, but there would be no real reason to have the road if we, if a true laissez-faire capitalist society were implemented, we'd have flying cars because there would be no reason to keep the road, and that the government keeps. The only reason we still have a road is because the government makes incentives to keep the road by keeping the road there. So, car manufacturers have incentives with oil manufacturers and blah, 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 and corporatism and, all that shit. But the fact of the matter is that I'm a realist. And I see shit that, if we just tore it down and implemented it right now, it would be fucking terrible. It would be. It'd be absolutely fucking terrible, and it would take several generations. And I'm not several like in 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 or 8, maybe 30 generations to actually adapt to a non-statist society, and break down our our beliefs of value and our beliefs of currency and our beliefs of property, because I just don't see that actually working, and I don't see people being violent and stuff. The human nature comes into effect and our animalistic qualities come into effect, and there needs to be some force. There needs to be some kind of force and some kind of incentive to behave properly, to act properly, and to even create things. I mean, there's only so far where, if you look at projects like Linux, it's done a really good job of keeping up, but you know, there's only so far you can do without tons of money or tons of reasons to innovate and tons of reasons to advance. I mean, it's difficult. I can't argue for anarcho-capitalism in a real world view. I can argue for the philosophy and how I can argue for the fact that it's an interesting philosophy and in a perfect world it would work, but there's no way in hell it would ever work in current modern day society. You can't tear down society and implement it, and it would just provide incentives for statism and probably incentives for people to reestablish a state. I just can't ever see it working. Libertarianism is at least somewhat plausible. I can't see anarcho-capitalism ever working, ever. Samuel out.